I'm going to run through some of the basic transformations that you should have been able to see with the sine and cosine graphs. They're going to be the same for both sine and cosine, just other than the fact that the two graphs start in slightly different positions. But everything else should stay the same. So first thing, just multiplying the function by a negative. Should take the graph. If you notice, it basically just flipped the graph over. It's a reflection technically over the midline, wherever the midline ends up being. So basically, you would take the sine of an angle, and then it's going to make whatever the result is negative. So if you get a negative, it would be positive. If you get a positive, it would be a negative. And basically, all your values would just switch. All of your positive values become negative. Your negative values become positive. So basically, just a reflection over the axis. If you multiply the sine function by a value, notice if I multiply by 2, all of my y values will be twice as high as they were before. So for example, that maximum value of 1 ends up being a maximum value of 2 now. That maximum value, a minimum value of -1 ends up being -2. It's really changing the amplitude of the graph. Okay, so notice if I multiply by 3 there, it maxes out at 3, and it now goes down to -3. Okay, so the amplitude of the function would be 3. Now be careful, because I could have a -3 out there, and the amplitude will still be +3. Okay, but the graph will be flipped upside down. The sine function will go down first, and then it'll go up. Okay, so that's a transformation that's pretty important. You can change the amplitude there. All right, adding or subtracting a value. So you're taking the sine of a value, and then you're adding something to it before you get your y coordinate. So if I add 2, notice my midline shifted. My midline had been at y equals 0, the x-axis. Now my midline is at y equals 2. Okay, this shifted the graph up 2 units. If I do -1, it's going to shift the graph down 1 unit. You can see there the midline is at y equals -1 now. Okay, so adding or subtracting a value to the sine or cosine function should just shift it up or down that amount. Okay, and if I did something like 3 sine of x -1, notice it's still shifted down 1 unit. The midline would be right here at -1, but notice now it goes 3 units. It's going 3 units above -1, and it's going 3 units below -1. So we see an amplitude of 3, and we see it's been shifted down 1. Okay. The other things that are relatively easy to see, if you add or subtract a value to the x, if you remember when we worked with parabolas, if you add or subtract a value to the x, it would shift it left or right. The exact same transformation works here. If I do x -45, it's going to move the graph 45 degrees to the right. Okay. If I do x plus 60, it's going to move this thing 60 degrees to the left. Okay, so if you add, it'll move it to the left. If you subtract, it'll move it to the right, kind of the opposite direction of what you think. But that has to happen inside parentheses. Okay, and then the last thing here, and this is something I want to take a little bit more of a look at in a later video. You can take your x value and you can multiply it by something. For example, I could do sine of 3x, or I could do sine of 6x, and you notice my graph moves much more quickly. Okay, somehow or another that's affecting the period. Or if I do 0.5x, we get a very long period like that. So I'm going to come back and I'm going to look at that in a different video, because there's a little bit more going on here as far as the pattern. It's not just exactly the number that you type in that's being affected. So somehow or another it's affecting the period, but the question as to how it's affecting the period is something I will look at in a different video. So see you there.